Welcome to G Fun Facts Online. Imagine a world where the greatest act of creation becomes an instrument of destruction. What if I told you that the invention of the forest, one of the most beautiful and vital developments in our planet's history, triggered a global catastrophe that wiped out 75% of all species? Today, we travel back 372 million years to uncover the story of the Late Devonian mass extinction, a crisis where the greening of the continents turned the oceans into a poisoned chalice. Let's journey back to the world before the trees. The Devonian period was a planet of water. Two supercontinents, Gondwana and Euramerica, were surrounded by a vast global ocean, and sea levels were so high that warm, shallow seas stretched for thousands of miles across the land. These sunlit seas were incubators for life, home to the most extensive reef systems Earth had ever seen. But these weren't the coral reefs we know today. They were built by extinct tabulate and rugose corals, alongside massive mound-building organisms called stromatoporoids. These colossal structures were bustling metropolises of biodiversity. Brachiopods filtered nutrients from the water, trilobites scuttled across the seafloor, and crinoids, or sea lilies, waved their feathery arms in the currents. This era is famously known as the Age of Fishes, for good reason. The oceans were ruled by armored, jawless fish called ostracoderms, but the great evolutionary leap of the time was the jaw. This triggered an explosion of new life. The placoderms, a class of armored fish, rose to become the apex predators. The most formidable of them all was Dunkleosteus, a creature the size of a large shark, armed not with teeth, but with terrifying, self-sharpening bony plates that could shear through almost any prey. Alongside them, the first sharks and bony fish were beginning their evolutionary journey. But while the oceans were vibrant and full of life, the land was a different world. It was mostly barren. Life had begun its conquest, but it was a timid one. The first vascular plants, like Cooksonia, were tiny, just a few centimeters tall, forming little more than a green fuzz along the edges of rivers. The soil was just broken rock and microbes. For millions of years, the land was a silent backdrop to the drama unfolding in the oceans. This was about to change dramatically. The greening of the continents, often called the Devonian plant explosion, was a cascade of evolutionary innovations that would permanently rewire the planet. It began with those small waterside plants evolving better plumbing vascular tissue that allowed them to grow taller. By the Middle Devonian, around 390 million years ago, the first true forests appeared. Fossils from England reveal stands of strange-looking trees called Calamophyton, with hollow trunks and twig-like growths instead of leaves. They were alien, but they were a monumental step. They developed more substantial root systems, stabilizing the ground and changing how rivers flowed. But the true game-changer was a group of plants called the progymnosperms, and specifically, the genus Archaeopteris. Appearing in the Late Devonian, Archaeopteris was arguably the first modern tree. It had a strong, woody trunk like a modern conifer and could grow up to 30 meters or nearly 100 feet tall. It had large, fern-like fronds that created a dense canopy, shading out its competitors. Most importantly, Archaeopteris developed the first truly extensive and deep root systems. Before this, plant roots barely penetrated 20 centimeters. Archaeopteris roots could drive more than a meter deep into the ground. This had two profound consequences. First, it anchored the tree and let it tap into deeper water, freeing it from the wetlands. Archaeopteris spread rapidly, forming the world's first global forests, from the tropics to near the Antarctic Circle. The second consequence was planetary in scale. These deep, powerful roots became engines of change. They burrowed into bedrock, breaking it apart physically. They also released acids that dramatically accelerated the chemical weathering of rocks. This process began to create the world's first deep, complex soils, a rich mantle of weathered minerals and decaying plant matter. But in doing so, the roots also unleashed a torrent of previously locked-away nutrients, especially phosphorus, into the world's rivers, and ultimately into the oceans. The greening of the land was about to trigger a crisis in the water. The new forests were inadvertently brewing a toxic cocktail for the oceans. The deep roots of Archaeopteris were mining the bedrock for nutrients. As vast forests lived and died, this immense new reservoir of biomass decayed, releasing unprecedented amounts of phosphorus into the rivers. This nutrient flood washed into the shallow seas, triggering a process we now call eutrophication, a deadly nutrient overdose. In the sunlit surface waters, this superabundance of nutrients was a spectacular boon for algae and plankton. Their populations exploded into colossal, planet-spanning blooms. But this was the first step in a catastrophic chain reaction. As this massive quantity of plankton died, it sank into the deeper water layers. There, bacteria began decomposing the organic rain, and in doing so, they consumed enormous amounts of dissolved oxygen. The scale of this organic fallout was so immense that it overwhelmed the ocean's ability to replenish its oxygen. Vast stretches of anoxic, or low oxygen, water began to form. These dead zones suffocated any marine life that couldn't escape. The rock record confirms this scenario. Late Devonian sedimentary layers show elevated levels of phosphorus, indicating a massive nutrient influx. These layers are often black shales, rich in organic carbon that failed to decompose in the oxygen-starved environment. This crisis wasn't a single event, but a series of devastating pulses. Two of these stand out: the Kellwasser and Hagenberg events. The Kellwasser event, around 372 million years ago, was a double pulse of severe anoxia. It was a hammer blow to the world's magnificent reef ecosystems. The stationary corals and stromatoporoids were unable to escape the suffocating waters and were decimated. Then, about 13 million years later, the Hagenberg event delivered the final blow as the Devonian period drew to a close. This crisis was particularly brutal for vertebrates, finishing off the already struggling placoderms and nearly all remaining jawless fish. While the plants as the trigger hypothesis is powerful, the full picture is likely a perfect storm of multiple crises. The greening of the continent set the stage, but other dramatic events were happening at the same time. Alongside evidence for anoxia, scientists have found another chemical signature in the rocks of the Kellwasser event: sharp spikes in mercury. Today, widespread mercury anomalies are a geochemical fingerprint of massive volcanic eruptions. Evidence points to major eruptions in Siberia and a supervolcano in what is now Australia. These eruptions would have spewed greenhouse gases and toxic compounds into the atmosphere, directly stressing ecosystems. It's now thought that the volcanic activity and the plant-driven nutrient crisis worked in tandem, pushing the Earth's systems past a tipping point. Paradoxically, while volcanoes cause short-term warming, the long-term effect of the new forests was global cooling. Plants are voracious consumers of atmospheric carbon dioxide. As forests expanded, they acted as a planetary-scale carbon sink. The chemical weathering of rocks, supercharged by the new deep-rooting systems, also draws down CO2. Evidence suggests that over the course of the Devonian, atmospheric CO2 levels may have plummeted from a high of around 4,000 parts per million down to near modern levels of 400 parts per million. This dramatic reduction in greenhouse gases likely triggered a period of global cooling and glaciation in the southern supercontinent of Gondwana. This cooling would have put immense stress on tropical marine species, particularly the warm-water reef builders already suffering from anoxia. So the Devonian extinction wasn't caused by a single culprit. The new forests loaded the gun by pumping nutrients into the sea and drawing CO2 from the sky. Volcanoes may have provided the trigger, and subsequent global cooling and glaciation added another layer of environmental stress. Caught in this crossfire, the once thriving marine ecosystems of the Devonian collapsed. Mass extinctions are not just about death, they are also about opportunity. They wipe the slate clean, creating ecological vacuums for survivors to fill. The world that emerged in the subsequent Carboniferous period was starkly different. Let's look at the losers. The devastation was most severe for the dominant life forms of the Devonian seas. The great stromatoporoid coral reef systems were the single greatest casualty. These massive ecosystems were almost entirely wiped out. It would take over 100 million years for coral reefs to recover to a similar global extent. The reign of the armored fish also came to an end. The diverse and fearsome placoderms, including the mighty Dunkleosteus, were completely eradicated. Most of the remaining jawless fish also vanished. Iconic Paleozoic groups like trilobites and brachiopods were severely crippled, their diversity plummeting. But where there are losers, there are winners. The survivors of the Devonian crisis were often more mobile and adaptable. With their competitors gone, these groups seized the opportunity. Sharks and their relatives, who had been relatively minor players in the Devonian, exploded in diversity. The extinction of the placoderms opened up the niche of apex marine predator. The next period, the Carboniferous, is often called the Golden Age of Sharks. Ray-finned fishes, the group that includes the vast majority of modern fish, also benefited. They proved more resilient and began a diversification that would eventually see them dominate oceans and rivers across the globe. Finally, the ammonoids, those coiled-shelled relatives of squid, were hit hard, but the few lineages that squeezed through the bottleneck radiated spectacularly in the early Carboniferous, becoming one of the most successful invertebrate groups of the Mesozoic era. The world that emerged from the Devonian extinctions was a world of swimmers and hunters, dominated by sharks and fast-moving bony fish. The revolution was complete. The series of events that transpired during the Devonian left a legacy that extends to our present day. This was a formative era that established systems that continue to govern our planet. The most profound legacy is the permanent link forged between the land and the sea. The evolution of deep-rooted forests meant that from the Devonian forward, the health of the oceans would be inextricably tied to what happens on land. The runoff of nutrients became a permanent feature of the Earth system. This ancient crisis serves as a powerful paleo-analog for modern environmental problems. The eutrophication and anoxia that devastated the Devonian seas are mirrored today in the dead zones that form in places like the Gulf of Mexico, where fertilizer runoff from agriculture creates the same nutrient overload cycle. The Devonian teaches us that the land and sea are one interconnected system. The deep, rich soils created by Archaeopteros changed Earth's surface forever, providing the foundation for all subsequent plant evolution. The burial of organic matter from the vast, swampy forests of the subsequent Carboniferous period, forests which owed their existence to these Devonian innovations, created the enormous coal seams that would one day fuel our own industrial revolution. Finally, the revolution in the seas was permanent. The extinction of the placoderms and the collapse of the ancient reef systems created an evolutionary void that allowed for the rise of the modern fish fauna we know today. In essence, the world we inhabit is a Devonian world. The soil under our feet, the composition of the air we breathe, the fish in the sea, and the delicate link between our forests and our oceans all have their roots in this turbulent and transformative period. It was a dramatic reminder that the greatest innovations on land can have revolutionary and unforeseen consequences in the sea.